Hi, it's Mark Lowe with Kentucky Tennessee Research. Don't know about you, I've been handling a lot of documents about taxes and preparing for income taxes. It's almost that time of year again. But one of the things that we often use in regard to our ancestors are property tax or poll tax and other types of license and tax that were assessed. So it's a good thing for us to learn about taxes and the great stories that they share. If you're wanting to learn more about these things, be sure to subscribe. But enjoy this session on taxes and the stories they share. Well, welcome to a discussion of taxes and the stories they share. This is Mark Lowe, and I appreciate you gathering with us tonight and looking at this in daytime, actually. Wherever you are, the study of taxes and, more importantly, the stories that relate to them, I think are an important part of our research and certainly a part of answering questions that I've looked at for years and years. Whether a person is a large owner of land, a small owner of land, or landless, they all are involved with taxes. And in fact, the illustration that I use, we'll discuss in just a little bit, is a taxing statement. It's a stamp of a way that they would be assessed, and that we look at those, because a taxation has been around ever since there were kings and kingdoms. By the time our Constitution was written in 1787, the colonies already were taxing citizens on their property. They were already doing what we called a capitation tax, or head tax, or poll tax. We'll talk about that. They were taxing livestock and other properties, and they even began to tax some other specific issues for business and other items. As we look at those, I think it'll help us understand that as we look at the conditions of the day, understanding how the taxes were applied, assessed, collected, and the punishment for not paying the taxes or the penalty, then we'll get a further clear idea of how our ancestors were affected by these things that we call taxes. Now, sometimes there are specific taxes. They are based on a number or a standard weight. That's called a specific or fixed tax. Other taxes vary in rate. They're called ad valorem taxes. That's when it's based on an assessment or a proportion or a percentage of a value. And generally property taxes are of this type. In other words, they're based on the property has a certain assessment. A tax has been assessed for ever so many dollars of value, and you calculate that varying upon that assessed value. So some of the other specific taxes might be more what we refer to perhaps as license taxes, or a fixed tax. This costs this much. And the variable tax is based upon what we call ad valorem. And there are multiple types of taxes throughout. The ones we're most familiar with in our study would be poll taxes. That would be or a capitation tax. Property tax upon the land. A business tax often can also be an ad valorem tax based upon the value or sales or that sort of thing. And there are licenses or permissions tax, similar in fact to what we would say a marriage tax or a dog tag. All of those are taxes, and we'll look at a variety of those from a colonial standpoint to those that we pay today, and then how to find them and listen to what stories we learn by looking at those. This is an article that ran in North Carolina about a story that was heard that Kentucky was going to lay a tax on the lands. Now, it didn't matter that the person lived there or not if they owned the tax. And the article says these are shameful projects for the purpose of getting the hands of non-residents, or getting the lands of non-residents. Well, in reality, that's how we understand it works today. But it shows the difference in the time period from the colonial time period till today, and how we base our tax burden and how those are assessed equally and fairly throughout the time periods we're researching. For example, the poll tax that we virtually don't recognize anymore in this country is really what was called, it's a capitation or head tax. The term poll is another term for a head. And so a person was opposed to tax just for being there. It's just a being tax. Capitation, again, per capita, each person paid the tax. It was later, and really very close to the early part of the 20th century, where it became assessed related to taxing directly, or to taxing. You had to pay your poll tax in order to vote. And so polling is counting heads. It's the same process, but remember, this in the early days had nothing to do with voting per se. This had to do with everybody paid the tax. We would see references to those on that time period even in the 20th century. This is a comptroller's report from one of the states. They almost all filed one, so if you look in your state, and you'll see that they're separated again by white and blacks. They're divided by professions and various types, and showing the changes in this type of tax over time. So we can find these reports to help us understand that. But let's look at how there was a dramatic change in the use of poll tax versus property tax. So let's go back to 1715. Okay? This is going to apply to North Carolina in specifically, but it's a perfect example for us to understand how there was a change. Now remember, North Carolina as a colony starting in the 1660s and rolling forward. But in 1715, the tax for the poll, which was upon the head, was for all free males over the age of 16. There was a tax assessed per individual, only men. It was also a tax for slaves, both male and female, over 12. And often, if you look at the tax books, it would refer to white poll and black poll. And they were often a different rate, so it was a count of people. Okay, that was the tax. In 1777, see, so a full 60 years after that time period, property tax was levied upon every type of property and became the principal tax. So really, all through the colonial period, the poll tax was the primary tax. And property tax began to be levied at that time period and began to swap over. Shortly thereafter then, 1784, the poll tax is only free men over age 21 and an assessment again for slaves, both male and female, between the ages of 12 and 50. Now by 1801, we're now exempting for the poll tax all males over the age of 50. And in fact, in some states, if they were paying a property tax of a certain level, they didn't also pay a poll tax. If they're paying a property tax of a certain amount, they would not be assessed a poll tax. So we're beginning to see some exemptions in regard to that. In 1835, with the new Constitution in North Carolina, poll tax is free males over the age of 21, and then slaves from between 12 to 50. Okay? 68, Constitution changed again, and each of those made the assessment or made the restriction upon the taxes. That in 68 forward, all males between 21 and 50 would be assessed a poll. 75% of that would be used for education. 25% of that would go for the care of the poor. The poll tax could not exceed $2 by the Constitution. Now, roughly 100 years after that, 1970, poll tax was abolished in that state. And for many states, in dealing with civil rights, of course, the poll tax became a federal issue because of the restrictions for voting. So you could see how they all got tied together. But see that from the beginning, poll tax, or the capitation tax, was the primary tax or revenue for the colonies. And it was only with the coming of the Revolutionary War, the changes, that we reverted to the property tax becoming more important. Georgia, for example, is an example of this published area. Look at these taxes. From 1885 and 86, this was the assessment of taxes for what Georgia considered their capitation tax. Every male was to pay $1. First day of April between the ages of 21 and 60. Now, those who were exempted, crippled, maimed, and disabled Confederate soldiers. Okay. An additional tax, practitioners of law, $10. Those who were photographers, $10. So in essence, these are not only the poll tax, but they would what I would be calling fixed license tax. An auctioneer, $25. Pool table, $25. So you can see how these are beginning to expand, that we're paying some business and fixed taxes and a capitation tax. I think that one goes a little further. Georgia, in that time period, there were others. So vendors who use boats, lightning rod dealers, etc., circuses, dealers and peddlers. So license fees, and what we recognize today as license, were originally just fixed taxes. Now there's a process of property tax and understanding how a tax is placed on the property or listed may help us in the process of seeing how, the process, forgive me for saying process, but it really is the process of becoming a part of the property tax rolls. It must be identified as to its ownership, location, and whether or not it is taxable. And that's referred to as the listing process. And that's usually done in a state by an assessor of property or a tax authority. Then that tax authority must, once it's determined it's taxable, estimate the market value of the listed property, usually done by a professional group to establish a countywide appraisals, and they will keep up with any changes to the properties. And so once a property is listed, then they're going to estimate and create an appraisal list, and that's the estimate of the market value of the property. Then the property must be formally placed on that property tax roll with the value to be taxed. That is the assessment. And you understand there is a difference between the market value of a property and the assessment value of the property. Okay? Those are two numbers, and understand the difference. They relate to one another, but assessment value is usually a lower level than the actual market value. And if not, then the next step, a person can review and appeal. Ask the taxing authority to make an adjustment. There's a step and a process for that to happen. In addition, someone related to the taxing authority must set the tax for current tax year. And that usually would be a board of aldermen in the county level. It could be a county court, state legislatures, whatever the group is for the taxing authority will set a tax rate. Then the taxing authority makes the process of beginning the billing process. In other words, they're going to take those assessments, take the tax rate, and then calculate your taxes for the given year. Then the tax authority will begin the collection of the taxes. And as you know, property taxes are usually collected annually. They have a certain date. You'll receive the bill several months prior to that date, knowing that situation. And of course, if they're not paid, there is a rate of assessment for the delay or a penalty that's added and calculated to that. So look at that process. Every new property has to go through that process of a listing, appraisal, assessment, and then review and appeal, and the tax rate and collection. Knowing that is not new. This is almost identical to the way from property taxes in the beginning. It's the same process. So there must be records related to those, and we look at them all the time. For example, the census record, this is the 1860 census, just one extract of it, and it's one that I use because it's very simple in format. But even though the question was asked by the Census Bureau enumerator, he would say, what is the value of your real estate? This is self-reported by the individuals listed. Now, this is not the same thing as the assessment for taxes. But over the years, certain folks felt like that's what the federal folks were doing. They were snooping and calculating that information. In reality, this is not where a county would get the assessment of value. It's self-reported. But knowing that it's there, it does help us as a clue because the census records are widely available and certainly help us when we're beginning to look at a taxing situation. Again, not only is there a report in most years of the value of real estate, but there also is a value for personal estate. So we can compare the values reported in these federal records to those that are reported at a local or county level. Again, with each process that we're doing research, it's important that we have a good plan. And I know I've said it too often, but I want to say it one more time. It is important. You should be thinking about the location, understanding that locations are specific, that the taxing authority, for example, will vary depending upon location, the laws for the given state, the time frame and the period. Things change, so we'll need to focus on where, when, and then the resources to help us answer those questions we have about the specific property, person, or location. And considering the folks around them, the associates, their neighbors, their good friends, their church folks, the members of their lodge, those folks also help us understand more about the community as we're researching individuals. Poll taxes, though, have been around, as I said, from the beginning, in essence. In often cases, in some jurisdictions, they are combined so that we have property taxes and poll taxes reported together. In this particular form, this is from a microfilm, so I'm sorry it's a little bit dark on the side, but you'll see there are names on the left. There are land indicating acres of land and the value assessed to those or lots. And then there are other personal properties, cash, money, carriages, pianos, watches. And then the very last column says poll. And notice that not everyone has a tick mark or a number there. They're not paying a poll. And most of those are because they're already paying a property tax. And again, there are various reasons, and sometimes if they are paying a poll, this is the way that we can use taxing information to indicate when a young man, for example, turns of the age to be taxed. He's usually taxed within the household of his father. We also can find notes in these tax books and tax lists, and they are readily available, and many of them have been filmed, and many of those that have been filmed are digitized and available from Family Search and Ancestry and other resources that we access. In this particular one, though, these young ladies that are here, they're being assessed because of property that they own. Okay, and it says very clearly orphan of. You'll see that there's an assessment, for example, of Negroes or money or acres of land. And all of these things in collection with a process that we will indicate by year, by district, by location. That's how we compile the information for taxes over time. And I'll show you an example of that in just a little bit. This information, though, can be written in a narrative format. Sometimes it's easier to have things in a tabular format like an Excel spreadsheet, but because taxes are so different and so variable, the easiest way to compile and collect it is just like you see in front of you there. There's the year, the page of the tax list, and the lines that we're going to find the individual referring to. If we can determine the date of entry, then we'll supply that date. The name, so if you'll follow me, 1799 page 10, lines 10 and 11, July the 10th. John McFarling, 200 acres on Green River. It's unclear as to the wording there, but that should be the location. 200 acres on Cypress, entered by Leary Jackson. That's how it appears. Surveyed by J. McFarland. Also, one white male above the age of 21. One black over the age of 16, so that's one total black, and 3 horses also assessed. Now, that's in a narrative format, but it's easy to follow. We can go right down to the next year, which would be another list. It's on page 7 of 1800, lines 15 and 16. John McFarling, there again, 200 acres. Second rate land, or 2-rate land on the Cypress, entered and surveyed for John McFarling. One white male above 21, one horse, 200 acres on the Cypress, entered and surveyed for Leroy Jackson. Notice the first one says Leroy Jackson, so we're copying exactly as we find it. We're going to continue in the process, same individual looking for the same person in the same county. 1801, page 10, John McFarling, 200 acres on the Cypress, entered by Daniel Rhodes. Surveyed for John McFarland, one white male above 16, and 3 horses. So we have a new white male appearing here, if you'll notice, the one above 21 and the one above 16. Slightly different information, and we'll want to compare it, and that's why the narrative is important. It may be more difficult to see it this way, but it's much easier to collect it from the tax list. You can copy the sheets. That's certainly admirable, and I would do that if I were building upon this case. I would want to be able to access it, but this is a better way to report it. It's very difficult because you have all the other names and other information, so refer back to the page, but this is the best way to compile it, report it, and follow it. Okay? So you see the variances and how it's been transcribed or extracted from that information. Now, we might also have the same situation of years where there's nothing there, for looking for the same people in the tax years prior. And there could be informations like this explaining what it is we're looking for and what we find. All pages are not legible. There's no McFarland entries found in that year. And see, we also were looking for fine eschewing. So if you'll see, this is the same process. We've looked at the records, we're identifying. This is how we compile and collect the information. And this is the type of information with looking at a lot of these. This comes easier with practice and entry, because the tax list varies from year to year. For example, this is the Chester County, Pennsylvania 1718 tax list. For one thing, it's still in pound, shillings, and pence because colonial time period. Stephen Evans is the first name on the right-hand side of the list, but you'll notice there's a listing for the cities, the 2 locations there, and a listing of names, and then what they are taxed with accordingly. And so Stephen Evans is taxed with 18 acres, a 0, a 4, and a 6. And up above, then there's the pound, shilling, and pence. The tax for Stephen Evans that year was 4 shillings and 6 pence. Now, that's a little different in the aspect of what we're looking at. And if you'll notice at the bottom, if you're already checking and looking things out, you'll notice these are not in alphabetical order, and sometimes tax lists are, and sometimes they're not, or they're collected in general alphabetical order. They're generally connected by a district or a township. Notice that we have folks who are paying taxes and they're non-resident lands. So again, understanding the reasoning why and how this happens to be, I think is important for us to understand. Now, this is another one from Chester County. It's a little bit different year, and I wanted to zoom up so you see the difference. These are beautiful records, by the way. And what I've done is written what's across the top of this chart down the right side, so it's a little easier for you to read quickly as we're going through there. So basically there's land, horses and mares, cattle, servants, their length of servitude, slaves, if they have plates, distilleries, tanyards, grist mills, sawmills, and fulling mills or felting mills. And so this is the purpose of this tax and the collection thereof, the names that are written down the left-hand side. And you'll notice as we go down where, for example, John Burkwalter, if you go across, he has 2 distilleries and that word written in distiller. So this tells us a lot more. That's a story in and of itself. There's storekeepers listed. So as we collect the information, we're learning the value of the property that they own, taxes, and other personal property. And we're also understanding more about the occupational situations of these individuals. Now, let's go to another location. Virginia has some of the best taxes. Virginia and Kentucky really have the best for us to follow and use regularly. So much of the early ones, there are some that are missing, but so many are there that it's very helpful to us. We're going to find the same type of information. I've tried to indicate down the right side what is collected on this tax list with the individuals there. But what's so good about Virginia taxes is not only do we have the names of the person chargeable with a tax, then we're going to have the additional folks, and I've got the arrow pointing down there to white males that are in the tithable list above 21. They're in the household of Thomas Holder. But there's Thomas Holder, James Holder, and John Holder, which indicate they are in that household. Again, it's the indication of being young men from that household. Often we are able to actually put them with the owner or the father at that point in time. So notice the difference in the time period. The record looks different. Again, you could collect the page, but for you to understand the entry, that narrative format that we talked about is still helpful because you go ahead and report what each mark or number stands for in the process. Again, a very similar one, but as we look at the individual sheets, this is a direct tax in Connecticut in 1798. Again, these are in dollars, cents, and mills, 1/10 of a cent. Names are collected in general, alphabetic by letter, and then what it's for houses or land and how much has been assessed. Very similar. This is in, again, this is in Pennsylvania. And you'll notice that now in Chester County, if we look at, there's Joseph Ashe. Now we have a dwelling house, 22 by 16 feet, built of stone. That is the description. The tax is $300. A log barn, 30 by 15, 70. A log shop, 16 by 12, 12. So these are combined, and there will be an assessment. This is the valuation list. This is not the tax list. This is the assessment or valuation list. But what a great description. I actually have a description of a stone house, 22 by 16. So this is more than just the amount of taxes. It really is a description of the locations, the story of that Joseph Ashe lives in a stone house within this community. And also we have his livestock. Now, as we continue to grow and move, and land is becoming so important, we begin to look at land based upon its class or quality, first, second, or third degree or classes. Generally, the best land or favorable will be class 1. Average, typical land, and that's the majority of it, would be class 2. And then difficult, heavily forested, rocky, high slopes, etc., might be classified as difficult. And so, although everybody might want theirs to be assessed at difficult, but they have favorable, there will also be those issues related to that. This is from Butler County, Ohio. It tells us the range and township. So in this particular process, we're able to provide something more than just a county and a location of the property, and then the assessment. So again, tax lists help us understand the quality of the land for farmers or storekeepers or whatever the situation is, more than just their ownership, the story of how it is described by others. And that certainly would be important. Now, unless you think it only applies to just the little old people somewhere else, this is the 1829 tax list for Nashville, Davidson County, Tennessee, and highlighted there, Andrew Jackson, that is the president, 900 acres. And the listing, you'll notice, he's not being assessed a poll tax, but he's being assessed 42 black polls there for his taxes there in the Nashville area at the time. And notice these, again, are somewhat alphabetical. Well, not really, not alphabetically, but they are collected by letter. Notice above Jackson that you have two folks there that are marked as insolvent, and we'll look at those a little bit later. Similar situations where there's nothing to, they cannot pay their taxes, they can't collect them, there's nothing to even assess it on any longer. And in case you wondered if somebody had dogs, well, in Hale County, Alabama in 1917, there was a dog tax, and here's the abstract. We don't have the names of the dogs, but we have the number of dogs and the number of tax assessed for each one. So again, It's just like a license fee. Anything like these that have been created over time for which there was a fee, there is a record. And all of those can be used if we understand how, what was required and how they were assessed, when they were collected, what their purposes were. Then we can use those in building the stories. Everything that we look at gives us information, and the taxes are definitely there. More than just the record themselves, the assessments, and if the taxes were delinquent or if there was some problem, all of those will play into other records, whether there's land, whether there's personal property, and certainly the problem with taxes may lead us into court records always. Now again, here's another assessment of land records that I wanted you to see over a couple of years where there's more information. And these are Kentucky counties where we're trying to follow someone over a period of time, follow their land, and make sure we're looking at the specific property. Let's go right down into the 1796 entries, for example. We're looking at Hamptons in particular. List 2, page 6, John Hampton, 260 acres of third-rate land on Raven Creek, entered by. So the tax list actually says it was entered by Lewis Craig, surveyed by Lewis Craig. 1 white male above 21, 6 horses, 8 cattle. Okay, 100 acres of third-rate land also on the Kentucky River in Clark County, entered by John Hampton. Same year. List 2, page 6. Andrew Hampton, 1,500 acres, third-rate land on Raven Creek, entered by Edmund Wooldridge. Same survey, patent. So we're following this over time. That's what those entries are. We're following a family. We're looking at who entered the property and surveyed the property. And certainly that's another whole thing in regard to land, in regard to the enter, survey, and registration. But know that the tax list in Kentucky, in particular, detail that information within the tax list for property itself so that we can follow it and determine we're talking about the same person. Because if we're talking about 200 acres of third-rate land on Raven Creek entered by Craig, that would be different than 260 acres of first-rate land on Raven Creek entered by Edmund Wooldridge. That's two different pieces of property. So it helps us in getting closer with that piece of information. Now, Confederates had taxes as well, and this is a receipt just like we would have for a property tax receipt in quote Union in the Union States, etc. And of course, after that, when we're reunited, we might find these in people's personal hands, their receipt, but we'll also find these in the collection of estates. So when you're looking at the estate of someone, often their tax receipts for at least those years at the time of their death would be included, and they're worth some closer analysis and following through with the details. Same thing's true with this tax assessment from Texas. Grayson Grayson in this particular process is 25 cents, $16.25 for the taxes for 1852. And it would indicate what it's for: 660 acres granted along the creek, 2 Negroes and 35 head of cattle, 1 wagon and carriage. So actually in this particular receipt, all this information is included. Now, we could actually go back to the assessment sheets or the tax payment sheets and find the specifics related to this individual. We have the date it was paid, but we also have the name and information. We can follow that just like poll tax over time, property tax, poll tax. If we're looking at an individual and we might find a change in names, sometimes if somebody's unusual, it could be that they're moving. This name in 1870, Wiley Gaines and Mankey Gaines. Now, that's 2 men of color, and they're only paying a poll tax. In 70, they're in the 6th district of Robertson County. In 72, neither of those individuals are listed. Now, I'm looking at Polks and Gaines. That's why the name changes. Notice in 75, neither of the 2 in 70 are there. But in 76, Mankey Gaines is back in that same district. Well, what's interesting about that is District 6 of Montgomery County and District 4 of I'm sorry, District 6 of Robertson County and District 4 of Montgomery County are just touching across the line. And Manatee Gaines is moving a little bit, or maybe he's not moving at all, but when the tax assessor visits, either he's not there or somehow the property of counting just him as an individual is missed. And often folks took advantage of the situation of saying, oh, I don't live in that county, I live in the other county. And then when the other county came, you say, oh, I don't live in that county, I live in that county. Well, eventually the state dealt with that, saying whoever saw them can assess them for the other county. So if they say, oh, I live in the other county, okay, fine, I'll take care of that assessment. So there was a way, because obviously some folks were trying to avoid the tax situation. We can also follow not only the poll tax, but we can, in later years, follow the property taxes in this extract of what it looks like. I'll show you another example of the actual tax list, but this is actually a typed copy of the information for a District 16 in Tennessee for the years 1903. And I'm just looking at particular names, the Bowie, the location. Notice that what follows in 1903, District 16, J.F. Bowie, those are the owners in the north, south, east, and west for the 105 acres. Now, if I don't know which hall that would be beside Mr. J.F. Bowie, I could certainly look at the deed. But I can also go to the tax list for District 16. I can go to the hall and look at in the name of Hall, and I can find the property of Mr. Hall that adjoins a Mr. Bowie. They probably also might adjoin Piles, Williams, or Anderson. You actually can determine which one it is. So we actually can follow it using the tax list along with then finding the property, the deed themselves. But we have to take into account local laws for the time period, when poll tax, when a person would come of age, when they would show up, and that would help us identify them specifically, that Dave Bowie, there in 1905, he might now be of age, just became old enough that that's his first poll tax, just like we looked at that earlier on that Virginia tax list. That's amazing that it would tell you so much about it. This is a list of folks assessed for a poll tax for 1921, and I wonder if you see anything interesting in this particular one. I leave it a bit open because I don't want you to say, oh, that's my ancestor there. Look at the first name on the list, Laura Albee. Oh, Mary Albee. On the second column over there, Mary J. Breen. This is 1921. We changed the law, and the first thing, when women were allowed the right to vote, they also were assessed taxes, just being poll taxes. That's another thing where it wasn't necessarily related directly, but it was. Because when they were assessed, the poll tax applied to everybody. And previously, it only applied to males. And with the change of suffrage in 1919, then in 1920, our tax rolls changed. So again, we now have another set of records with the females that we're looking at. Those who didn't own property would have been assessed a poll tax, just like their male counterparts would be. And we can actually use those records and the stories related to those individuals as well. We can look for maps as well within the taxing authority that will help us with property in particular, so that we can look at a particular township and identify the tax holders and their acreage. And they vary with the location, but these type of maps do exist, and they're worth our efforts if we're trying to find a family and don't know exactly where they are, or we can't find deeds, or something's missing. Then use the records that we have to answer the questions that we're trying to determine. For example, that beautiful township and range, kind of rectangular laid out, but this is a Tennessee property on our map, just a little cutout section of Sumner County, Tennessee. I think it's District 15, showing families there, and just kind of the dots as to where the people are located. Okay? And so, knowing the information and the format, the different taxing authorities, this one's not a property ownership map, but today if you look at the property ownership maps, and we will in just a second, they're very specific. We actually have the plot, the size of the property and everything. So it's not a dot on the map anymore. It's actually the property drawn. And you'll see the difference in where we are. And those are so accessible that we can actually follow those back to take a new piece of property and follow them back in time. So taxes help us with learning about who was the owner previously as well. So here's what the state of Tennessee example has of locating a current property owner information. So it's statewide. So any county in Tennessee, they're almost all accessible through this singular portal that's held. And so you change to the county name, and then you type the name of the current owner. Okay, you don't know the current owner, but you know the property address. You can type the property address. Or if you have the property parcel maps, you can actually type in the map and parcel number and go to that. Lots of ways to look. So with that information, we move forward to actually look at the property. Not only does it show us the property tax card, then we can actually get an aerial view, and this one actually has the natural view turned on. We can actually see it on a map, or we can see it with forest and trees and all this, much like we would look at Google Earth, by the way. And in fact, we can take a piece of property and tuck it right over to Google Earth. So you'll notice this is kind of an odd-shaped piece of property. It looks like there's a pond down to the lower right corner. It looks like a creek, the top, or a curved road. Now, I know it to be a creek up there. You'll tell that little line in there. But we can actually then look at that property and the tax information. Notice that this probably was a larger piece of property that's been cut out. And if you'll notice to the left, there's a subdivision where parcels have now been cut. Often, we can actually look at the property tax maps and see an older piece of property that has been cut over a period of time. So if we're looking for farm communities, that's a great way for us to actually see how they've been divided over time. Over the years too, the taxing authorities have created cross-index cards when they were trying to build these maps originally. And if they exist in the counties that you're researching in locations, just ask, are there property cross-index cards for property tax? Now, that would not be for poll, just property tax. And then within that, what they've basically done is just indexed it back for wills, deeds, so that you could follow it back, a particular property, through its various owners over time. Okay? And the advantage of that is certainly for title searchers, they do that all the time. But this was where the taxing authority was trying to make sure that they had all taxes that had been listed, all properties listed on the maps, and then matching authority. They're great resources when they're available, because this particular one, for example, would take us from a current piece of property and then show us that in 52, there's the book and page of its transfer. In 1937, this property was transferred in Will Book 33, page 200. Prior to that, the owner was John Cummings, found in Deed Book 77, page 304. Now, we could have done all that by using the deed books, but the taxing authority, if they've done the cross-index cards, actually have that information. Now, they may not all go back to this point. It may not be on what we call the tax card, which is literally what we looked at online a while ago, but we could actually look at that property, and it may go back only 2 or 3 of those steps, and they may have the earlier cross-index cards. That's our job, right? It's my job to pay attention, and I was getting really excited, so I jumped ahead for a second. Now, if you don't pay your taxes, and this is getting into some of the interesting story part, but here's an example of the listing, and usually these come out on Sundays, or at least in my part of the country. Everybody will talk about them at church, and they will pay their taxes. You don't want your name to show up. But this is a notice of those that are not only delinquent, but are delinquent at a point that they're now getting ready to approach selling them. This is Wilkes County, North Carolina from 1905. There's the listing of the owner, the acreage, and the amount of taxes. So J.A. Johnson is, they're going to sell 97 acres to get $2.51. Now, it sounds like a small amount, 1905, but again, the delinquency, they will assess that just to get that. And generally, if properties are sold for taxes and the tax lien is placed on them, often the person who is delinquent can go in and pay the taxes and reclaim the property even after it's sold. So you need to understand that how that works even in that case, and there's some in the court process of situation that varies, and it's helpful to understand how that works. But either way, check these lists, the newspapers. So we could be looking for a person there. If you find their name, then follow up with the records that exist for the delinquency and the property in general. And I'll show you some more of those. For example, if there's a tax sale, then I could go find these names. Now, it's hard for you to read, but as I was going through, there was John Molden, Joel Acuff, Lucinda Mayfield, Absalom Abbott, Epsom Salts Mining Company. Those are the four that are first named in this court to be sold in 1872. Now, one of the things I could do is just the tax books we were looking at. Now, I could go look at those tax books, okay? The tax books for Sevier County, Tennessee from 1864 to 1872 are on film number 969988. Now, I could go to a library that holds that film, like the Tennessee State Library and Archives. I could go to Sevier County and look at their tax books. I could go to the Family History Library and look at this particular film in 1872. Now, these are the taxes for the years 68, 69, and 70 that they're referring to in this case. So I actually could go back and actually look at the actual tax assessments and show that these have not been paid. Okay, so there's paperwork that attaches to these. So the newspaper might be a way to get you started. You could check the tax books directly, but you can also check to see if somebody is delinquent. Now, once they go to court, for various reasons, you're going to find the receipts included in that process, where they were paid and who they were paid to, and the benefit. All those little receipts will be included. And if you find a delinquent case, then it's a great information of how they perhaps got it out of delinquency and got caught up, etc. You're going to find subpoenas for folks to come in and testify the situation before property is sold. But if it's a simple tax information, it's usually just a combination of all the properties that are delinquent being brought together at one point and saying, okay, we're going to sell them. And the note that if they're published in the paper, folks will show up to take care of that. It still works, doesn't it? It would work, trust me. Now, in the county where I live, we have the assessment books, and those were where the various folks in each of the districts were going to the individuals and double checking if there were changes in their property and just relisting and making sure in the district. And so we're in the process of indexing those. And I want to give you an example of, for example, in 1911 in the first district, a set of what we're looking at. So generally it's the name, first and last name, and the district and the year. But also if they paid a poll or other information. But you'll notice that there are notes, and we collect those because that's one of the most valuable things about these assessment books. For example, under J.W. Austin, the third name there on the list, Bob Turner assessed in the 2nd District and he sold 40 acres. This is the note to us that part of the land has been sold to somebody else. If you'll follow that down to the the Anderson, W.W. Anderson down there, sold to C.R. Anderson 125 acres. Often it would be, say, sold to so-and-so, and that person shows up in the tax list the next year. We might actually have house burned or new house built. We use these from a historical aspect to sometimes prove something like that, when a house was built, if we don't have any other dating information. So tax assessment books are of a great value to us, and trust me, I just pulled one little section of the notes that were in there. There's a lot of information found in these assessment books. In those court cases, here's an example of the assessment and tax book itself. This one actually has the recording of the taxes. These are the names that were collected by this particular assessor. It has the owners in the north, south, east, and west. That's the names that follow in the middle part. And then there will be the assessment amount or acreage and the value. Then the next page typically is going to show us who's paid them. But note that there are notes on this page. It's very similar to the assessment books that we were looking at earlier, with just lots more information on them in particular. These are very helpful to look at locations or previous owners, or if we had lost deeds, we could actually begin to piece some stuff together. So this is the left side of this big book. Let's go to the right side. Same page. This is the right side. We're going to see the value of the taxes involved there. And then we're going to look at all these notes that are in there. They're going to be paid, they're gone, no good, meaning that there's not there. This is not good. We're not going to be able to get the money out of it. The amount that's there, if it was paid, we often have dates, and stamps, and other information in these taxing books. So once you begin to locate them and see what's available, there's so much information. It's just making sure you track all the little pieces of that story related to those taxes, and then what does that mean? Not only once you find it, what does it mean, and how will it help me understand more about them? Some states collect all their tax debtors. North Carolina does this. There's a website. You could actually go look up North Carolina tax debtors, and you can actually see by location properties and assessments that are still due. And it's a way for them to try to, hey, get the word out. Hey, we need our money. And so those have been, that's a little more modern than the old day. But if somebody was, well, maybe they were insolvent, how do you get them off the list? And generally that's referred to as a tax release book or a list. And generally, when we start the season with the assessment, those people who are ordered to collect it, we have the assessment. Let's say we add up the assessment and all the property is worth $1 million. We're going to charge that assessor with collecting $1 million. Okay? The only way to clear that then is if he doesn't collect $1 million, why not? And that would be what's called a tax release. We're going to remove people from that assessment or from that and subtract them. And that is exactly what you see in front of you. It's where these individuals who have a tax assessed, and the reason they can't pay it or need to be removed, whether insolvent, meaning they can't pay it and there's nothing to collect, whether they've removed from the district or moved out of state, whether they're overage, whether they were double assessed, or they were underage, never should have been assessed, or maybe they just died. Again, so much information related to this specific information, because even without vital statistics, if you know the ages that poll taxes turn on and off, we can actually calculate an age of a person coming on the poll tax or being removed because they're overage. So much information. Being insolvent, we're talking about, in this particular case, these poll taxes we're talking about are $2. So it's a time period of being insolvent or dying. And so we can actually look for the additional records that support this just by finding them on this reference. Now, these are generally then reported, this is a similar thing, where they're reported in county court minute books as well. So they may be in a separate book, or they may be reported in the county court minutes where they're removing those by district to take them off the list. And all these are because they were assessed either double assessed twice, or they're adjusting the assessment. Again, lots of information. Makes me want to go look at tax lists right now. I love taxing. I don't like to pay them necessarily, but I know that the taxes I pay support the library and archives that I love so well. That's okay. I kind of trying to think of that as the good side. Follow with me just a few minutes. These three men who were found on these tax lists for 1881 and 82, Jim Elder, Jim Higgins, and Locke Mallory. Okay? I've kind of combined these, and this is Robertson County in the minute books for January 5th, 1881. I put the blue stars there so you can find them. Jim Elder down in the lower left, he is insolvent He could not pay his taxes. Jim Higgins at the top, he is insolvent, could not pay his $2 poll tax. Locke Mallory is removed. He is not living in the area now. He cannot pay his taxes. But look at the following year. Same men appear on these the release the next year. James Elder hung. Jim Higgins hung. Locke Mallory hung. When I first ran across this, I looked for the legal definition of hung, because I understand that the other word that we think of is actually hanged. We generally, a person is sentenced to be hanged, not hung, but I understand the similarness. But the clerk or the assessor put this in here. It's an odd time and kind of a bad thing in one sense, but these three people were actually hanged. And in this tax note, it's reported in that year. Now, I could have just told you that we're tough on delinquent tax holders in my county. Not quite that. Fortunately, we're not quite that harsh. But notice that this person thought it was important enough that we know. And I only caught that because of the district that they lived in, and that's where they were, and that's when it happened. If you want to know about that story, catch me and I'll tell you more about the three men in our tax list. You know, taxes tell us so much, and they're part of militia records as well. They're in those county levels, and in the early days, often a militia captain was responsible for collecting the taxes within his district. And so they're so closely associated. Understanding how that all works in the states where you're researching, I believe, is an essential part of understanding taxes and road crew and jury duty and militia service. Just being a good citizen. Now, we may have seen the back of this a while ago, this stamp. This is a tax for photographs. And you'll see that as a stamp on there. It was a tax being assessed for it. And fortunately, this is a picture of Callie Johnson. Lovely lady there, but it's a reminder of the stories that we tell. Taxes had an influence on that because that tax is right there on that photograph. We don't see that as often today, but however, even though it's not a tax, there's a fee for every package that we mail, every business, every birthday card you send. It's a stamp. It's a different thing, and every one of those tells a story. As we begin to look at those records, we as researchers understand the value of the little pieces of information that give us clues to not only the people who sent that or who paid that, but the reason they may have chosen a particular stamp or a particular location. Maybe it was cheaper to have your picture made in Nashville than it was in Lebanon or in another city in Tennessee. You know, there's so many records about money. That more than taxes, these are records to have something recorded. And in this particular case, they're marriages. The first two are marriages. It's a 50-cent fee to buy a marriage license. That's a tax. To have a mortgage recorded or probated, which is what the term means. To have something recorded is to have it probated. It was a 25-cent fee. Very similar. There are record books of fees because if we follow the money, and that's what taxes are, we can follow that money to both the individuals, the land, the people involved, and help us understand more about that particular situation. It's all about keeping it in the plan, thinking of the 5 items that we need to make sure we're on track, we're in the right location, the right time period, we're looking in the right resources. Are we asking the right questions, and are we looking at all the people around the families that we're researching? Taxes and the stories that they share only begin when we begin to look at the records. You know, looking at the back of this photograph only tells us who did the picture. It tells us that there was a tax assessed, and in fact, if you could read closely, it tells you a little bit more. It also tells you that the person on the other side is Callie Johnson. But only till we discover the record and turn it over do we actually find out who Callie Johnson might look like. The records that you find regarding personal taxes, poll taxes, property taxes. Tell you more about the individuals when you collect them and compare them year by year. You put them in context with the neighbors and what other people are paying in the area. You put them in context with what's going on in a local, state, and national level. You take the people and put them in the context with the history of their time. The assessment of taxes during the Civil War, or the rebate of taxes in the 1890s as a conciliatory effort of the reuniting effort. It only takes one tax list to help you understand how important they are. You'll never know how until you take a look. Now, I hope I've got you wanting to go look at some taxes. I would suggest you go out there at a family search catalog under the category of land and taxes or taxation. If you'll click on taxation, you may find some tax books. If you'll click on that entry and go down in the catalog, you might see what looks like a little round roll of film. If so, it's on microfilm, but you can't view it there. But if you see a camera, those have been digitized. Not a bad idea to go and look at some of the areas you're interested in and see if those digital images are available tonight. But if you have questions about taxes or any of the things I might have told you in this time period, drop me an email. There's my email right there, and I look forward to hearing from you very soon. And I hope you'll join us at the next time we're together. In the meantime, go listen to those stories.